I used to think I would always know what was going on in my children's lives. Not because I expected them to tell me everything, but because, for most of their lives, they did. There was a time when I could read their moods from the way they closed the front door. When I knew who they were talking to just by the tone of their voice on the phone in the next room. When their days, their worries, their little victories, all of it, somehow passed through me, like I was a quiet center point they always came back to. I didn't notice when that started to change. Or maybe I did, but I didn't understand what I was noticing. It's strange how something can slip away so gradually that you only recognize the absence long after it's already gone. I still wake up early. That hasn't changed. Even now, I find myself in the kitchen before the sun fully rises, the house quiet in that familiar, almost comforting way. The coffee maker hums the same way it always has. The light above the sink flickers for a second before settling, like it's still deciding whether it wants to be part of the morning. For years, mornings were my favorite time. When the kids were young, it was the only moment that felt like it belonged just to me. I would sit at the table with my coffee, sometimes still half asleep, listening for the first signs of movement upstairs. A door creaking. Small footsteps. The sound of someone calling out, still wrapped in sleep. "Mum, where's my blue shirt?" Or, "Dad, do we have cereal?" Those little voices, they filled the house before the day even had a chance to begin. Back then, everything felt busy, but it also felt full. I knew exactly where everyone would be at any given time. School schedules pinned to the fridge. Soccer practice on Tuesdays. Piano lessons on Thursdays. Weekend games, birthday parties, homework at the kitchen table. There was always something. And somehow, in the middle of all that noise, I felt necessary. That's the word that comes to mind now. Necessary. They needed rides. They needed lunches packed. They needed someone to check their homework, to listen to their stories, to sit on the edge of their bed when they couldn't sleep. And I was there for all of it. I can still picture those evenings so clearly. The kitchen would be warm from the stove, the smell of whatever I was cooking settling into the walls like it belonged there. One of them would be at the table, pretending to do homework but mostly doodling. Another would be on the floor, building something or flipping through a book. The TV might be on in the background, but no one was really watching it. We were together. Not in some grand, memorable way. Just together. And at the time, it felt so ordinary that I didn't think to hold on to it. I thought it would always be like that in some form. That's the part no one really explains to you. People tell you your kids will grow up. They tell you time moves fast. They warn you, even, to enjoy it while it lasts. But no one tells you how quiet it gets. Not right away. At first, the changes seem like progress. They start doing things on their own. Making their own friends. Closing their doors more often. You tell yourself it's a good sign. It means they're becoming who they're supposed to be. I remember the first time one of them didn't want me to walk them to school. It caught me off guard more than I expected. "I can go by myself," they said, not in a rude way, just certain. I stood there for a second, keys in my hand, trying to decide if I should insist. But I didn't. I smiled, told them to be careful, and watched them walk down the street alone for the first time. There was pride in that moment. And something else I couldn't quite name. Looking back now, I think that was the beginning of learning how to let go, even though I didn't realize that's what I was doing. The years moved the way they always do, slow when you're in them, fast when you look back. School turned into high school. Activities became more serious. Friends became more important. Dinner at the table became less consistent. At first, it was understandable. "I have practice. I'm studying with friends. I'll eat later." You adjust. You leave food in the fridge. You stop waiting for everyone to sit down together. You tell yourself it's temporary. And for a while, it feels like it is. Because they still come to you. Maybe not as often. Maybe not with everything. But enough that you still feel connected. They still ask for advice. They still sit with you sometimes, late at night, talking about things they won't say during the day. Those moments become more valuable, more fragile. You don't realize it then, but you start holding on to them a little tighter. I remember one night in particular. It must have been around midnight. The house was quiet, and I was already in bed when I heard a soft knock on the door. "Are you awake?" Of course I was. I always was. They came in, sat at the edge of the bed, and started talking about something that had happened with friends. It wasn't a big thing. Just the kind of situation that feels enormous when you're young and trying to figure out where you fit. I listened. That's what I had always done. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to fix it. I just listened. And when they were done, they looked at me the way they used to when they were little, like I might have an answer that could make everything make sense. I didn't have one. But I said something anyway. Something simple. Something honest. They nodded. Stayed for a few more minutes. And then they left, closing the door softly behind them. I remember lying there afterward, staring at the ceiling, feeling grateful. Like I had been trusted with something important. Those moments became fewer over time. Not all at once. Just gradually. They got older. More independent. More sure of themselves. And less in need of me in the ways they once were. Again, I told myself this was how it was supposed to be. This was the goal, wasn't it? To raise them to stand on their own. To build lives that didn't revolve around you. I believe that. I still do. But believing something and feeling it are two very different things. The house started to change long before anyone officially moved out. Rooms stayed cleaner. Not because anyone was cleaning them, but because they weren't being used the same way. The noise softened. Fewer voices overlapping. Fewer arguments over small things. Fewer moments where I had to step in and mediate or remind or guide. At first, it felt like relief. A kind of earned quiet. But quiet has a way of stretching. It doesn't stay comfortable forever. Eventually, it starts to echo. The first time the house felt too big, I didn't say anything. It was late afternoon. The light coming through the windows had that soft, golden tone that used to signal the start of the evening routine, homework, dinner, conversations. But no one was there. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, not really doing anything. Just standing. Waiting, maybe, without realizing I was waiting. That was around the time the calls started to change. At first, they were frequent. Updates about classes, new jobs, new apartments, new people in their lives. I listened the same way I always had. Asked questions. Offered thoughts when it felt right. But slowly, those calls became shorter. Less detailed. More surface level. "I'm busy, but everything's good. I'll call you later. We should get together soon." Soon became a word that didn't mean anything anymore. Weeks passed. Then months. I told myself they were building their lives. That this distance was natural. Healthy even. And I meant it. At least, part of me did. The other part noticed things I didn't say out loud. Like how I started hearing about certain events after they had already happened. A trip. A gathering. A decision. Not because they were hiding anything, but because it didn't occur to them to mention it beforehand. That's when something small shifted inside me. Not sharply. Not painfully. Just enough that I noticed. I remember one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me. I had picked it up a few times, thinking about calling. Just to check in. Just to hear their voice. But I hesitated. Because I didn't know if I'd be interrupting something. And that thought, that small, quiet hesitation, felt unfamiliar. There was a time when I never questioned reaching out. When I knew exactly where I stood in their day. Now, I wasn't so sure. I set the phone back down. Took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. And sat there longer than I needed to. Telling myself it was nothing. That I was overthinking. That this is just what happens. And maybe it is. Maybe this is just another stage of life that no one prepares you for. But that evening, something settled in a way it hadn't before. Not a realization. Not yet. Just a feeling. Quiet. Persistent. Like the beginning of understanding something I wasn't quite ready to fully admit. I didn't call that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure anymore what the right moment was. That uncertainty stayed with me longer than I expected. It followed me into the next morning, into the quiet routine I still held on to like it might anchor something that felt like it was slowly drifting. I made my coffee the same way. Sat in the same chair. Looked out the same window. But there was a thought sitting just beneath everything else. A question, really? When did I start second-guessing something that used to feel so natural? I tried to brush it off. You learn to do that as you get older. You learn not to overreact to every small shift, every passing feeling. You tell yourself that not everything needs to mean something. But some things stay. They don't demand attention. They don't interrupt your day. They just wait quietly in the background until you can't ignore them anymore. A few days later, I decided to call anyway. It was mid-afternoon. I remember because the house had that stillness it gets around that time, when the day feels like it's paused for a moment before evening begins. The phone rang longer than I expected. For a second, I thought it might go to voicemail. Then it picked up. "Hey," they said. Their voice sounded normal. That's the word that comes to mind now. Not distant. Not cold. Just normal. "Hey," I said back, trying to match that tone. We talked for a few minutes. About work. About the weather. About something they had planned for the weekend. I listened, asked questions when it felt right, the same way I always had. But something about it felt different. Not in what was said. In what wasn't. There were no pauses where they filled the silence with something unexpected. No small confessions. No lingering thoughts. Just information. Clean. Efficient. Polite. At one point, there was a small gap in the conversation. Not long. But long enough that I felt it. I waited. They didn't add anything. And for the first time, I realized I didn't know what to say next. That had never happened before. Eventually, they said, "I should probably get going." "Of course," I replied quickly, as if I had expected that all along. "We'll talk soon." "Yeah," they said. Soon. The call ended the same way it always did. But I sat there for a moment afterward, holding the phone in my hand longer than necessary. Trying to understand why something so ordinary felt so unfamiliar. I told myself it was just a busy day. That I had caught them at the wrong time. That next time would feel different. There's comfort in those kinds of explanations. They give you somewhere to place the feeling without having to examine it too closely. But over the next few weeks, I started to notice more things. Small things. The kind that don't stand out on their own, but together they start to form a pattern. Messages that took longer to get a response. Plans that stayed vague. Conversations that stayed on the surface. I began to realize that I was the one reaching out more often. Not in a way that felt desperate. Just, consistently. And they would respond. They always did. Kindly. Respectfully. But rarely first. I tried not to let that bother me. I reminded myself of all the things they were managing now. Jobs. Relationships. Responsibilities I used to carry for them. It made sense. It really did. But understanding something doesn't always soften it. One evening, I decided to cook a proper dinner. Not just something simple for myself. A real dinner. The kind I used to make when everyone was home. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I thought it would bring something back. Or maybe I just missed the feeling of preparing something that mattered to more than just me. I took my time with it. Cutting vegetables slowly. Letting the stove warm the kitchen the way it used to. Setting the table without really thinking about it. Halfway through, I realized what I was doing. There were more plates than I needed. I stood there for a moment, looking at the table. Then I quietly put the extra plates back. The kitchen felt different after that. Still warm. Still familiar. but smaller somehow. I ate alone that night. The food was good. But that wasn't really the point. After dinner, I cleaned up more slowly than usual, letting the routine stretch out, as if it might fill the space. At some point, I found myself thinking about the last time we had all sat together like that. Not a holiday. Not something planned. Just a normal evening. I couldn't remember. That bothered me more than I expected. You don't expect ordinary moments to disappear. You assume they'll always be there, quietly repeating themselves in the background of your life. Until one day, they're not. A week or so later, I heard about a small gathering. Not directly. It came up in passing, during another phone call. "Oh yeah, we all got together last weekend," they said casually. It took me a second to understand what they meant. "All?" I asked. "Yeah, just everyone. Nothing big." I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. "That sounds nice." "It was," they said. And then the conversation moved on. But I stayed there for a moment. On that word. Everyone. I didn't ask why I hadn't been invited. Not because I didn't want to know. But because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. There are questions that, once asked, can't be taken back. And I wasn't ready for that. So I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But something had shifted again. A little more this time. A little harder to ignore. That night, I walked through the house without really having a reason to. From one room to another. Looking at things that hadn't changed. The same furniture. The same pictures on the walls. There's one photo in the hallway I've always liked. It was taken years ago. We're all in it. Standing close together, smiling at something just outside the frame. No one looks uncomfortable. No one looks distracted. It's the kind of picture that doesn't feel posed, even though it is. I stopped in front of it longer than usual. Studying the faces. Trying to remember exactly what that day felt like. Not just what we did. But how it felt to be part of that moment without question. Without distance. Without hesitation. It's strange how memory works. You can recall details. What people were wearing, what the weather was like. But the feeling itself becomes harder to hold on to. Like trying to remember the exact warmth of something long after it's gone. I stood there until the light in the hallway shifted, telling me it was getting late. And then I moved on. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be. Just because I couldn't sleep. I made my coffee again. Sat at the table. Looked out the window. But this time, I didn't try to push the feeling away. I let it sit there with me. That quiet realization that had been forming slowly, piece by piece. It wasn't that my children didn't care about me. I knew they did. I could hear it in their voices. See it in the way they still spoke to me. That hadn't disappeared. What had changed was something else. Something harder to define. I was no longer part of the center of their lives. I had moved to the edges. Not intentionally. Not consciously. Just, naturally. The way things do. And the hardest part wasn't the distance itself. It was realizing that it had happened without a clear moment. No conversation. No decision. No single point where everything shifted. Just a slow, quiet movement, until one day, you look around and realize you're standing somewhere different than you used to be. Later that day, I picked up my phone again. Scrolled through old messages. Photos. Little pieces of conversations that used to feel like they were happening in real time, but now felt like something from another life. I found one message in particular. It was from years ago. "Can you pick me up?" Simple. Uncomplicated. A small request that carried so much meaning at the time. I stared at it longer than I expected. Because it wasn't really about the ride. It was about being needed. About being part of something immediate and important. And I realized I hadn't received a message like that in a long time. Not because they didn't need anything, but because they had learned not to need me in the same way. That evening, I almost called again. My hand even hovered over the phone. But this time, the hesitation felt different. Heavier. Not just uncertainty, but something closer to doubt. Not about them. About me. About where I fit now. I set the phone down. Sat back in my chair. And for the first time, I let the thought fully form. Not push it away. Not soften it. Just let it be what it was. I am no longer part of their everyday lives. The words didn't feel dramatic. They didn't even feel sharp. Just true. And in that truth, there was something that settled deeper than anything before it. Not an ending, but a kind of quiet acceptance beginning to take shape. Even though I wasn't sure yet what to do with it. I didn't say those words out loud. I am no longer part of their everyday lives. I just let them sit there, quietly, the way you let a truth settle when you're not sure what it will change. For a few days after that, I moved through my routine a little more carefully. Not differently, exactly, but with more awareness. I noticed how often I reached for my phone without a clear reason. How often I expected something, a message, a call, even just a small interruption, to fill the space. And how often that expectation went unmet. It wasn't painful in the way I might have imagined years ago. It was softer than that. Quieter. Like something that had already happened, and I was only now catching up to it. I started going for walks more often. At first, it was just to pass the time. Late afternoons, usually. That hour when the light begins to fade but the day hasn't fully let go yet. There's a park not too far from the house. I've passed it countless times over the years, but I never really spent time there. Back when the kids were young, there was always somewhere else to be. A game, a practice, an errand. Now I had time. So I walked. Slowly. Past the same benches, the same trees, the same paths I'd probably seen before without noticing. And I started noticing things. Parents with small children, calling out reminders. Don't go too far, be careful, come back here. The children didn't always listen. They rarely do. But they always looked back eventually. Always made sure someone was still watching. I would sit on a bench sometimes, not too close, not too far, just there. Observing. Remembering. There was one afternoon that stayed with me. A little boy had wandered farther than he was supposed to. Not dangerously far. Just enough that his mother stood up a little straighter, her voice changing slightly as she called his name. There was a brief moment, just a few seconds, where he didn't respond. And I could see it in her posture. That small flicker of worry. Then he turned. Ran back. Everything returned to normal. But I stayed with that moment longer than I expected. Because I recognized it. Not the situation exactly, but the feeling underneath it. That instinct to call someone back. To make sure they were still within reach. And I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. There comes a point when they don't turn back as often. Not because they're lost. Not because they don't care. But because they've learned how to keep going without needing to check. And maybe, that's what we spent all those years preparing them for. It just doesn't feel the way you think it will. One evening, not long after that, I got a message. It wasn't anything unusual. Hey, just checking in. How are you? I stared at it for a moment before responding. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was trying to understand what I felt. A week ago, that message might have felt like too little. Like something that came out of obligation. Now, it felt different. Still small. Still simple. But real. I'm doing okay, I wrote back. Just had dinner. It was quiet. I hesitated before sending it. Not because it wasn't true, but because I wasn't sure if I wanted to let that truth be seen. Then I sent it anyway. There was a pause. A longer one than usual. I almost regretted it. But then the reply came. Yeah, it gets quiet, doesn't it? I read that line a few times. There was something in it. Not guilt. Not pity. Just recognition. And for the first time in a while, the silence between us didn't feel like distance. It felt like something shared. We talked a little longer that night. Nothing deep. Nothing dramatic. But a little more open than it had been. A little less careful. And when the conversation ended, it didn't feel unfinished. That mattered more than I expected. Over the next few weeks, I started to adjust in ways I hadn't consciously planned. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring before I moved on with my day. Stopped measuring connection by frequency. Stopped expecting things to feel the way they used to. Not in a bitter way. Just, honestly. I began filling my time differently. Not as a distraction, but as something intentional. I signed up for a small class at the community center. Nothing complicated. Just something to be around people again, to have conversations that didn't depend on history or shared memories. At first, it felt strange. Being somewhere new. Not knowing anyone. Not having a defined role. But there was something freeing in that too. No expectations. No assumptions. Just presence. I started to see that my life hadn't become smaller. It had just become quieter. And quiet doesn't have to mean empty. It just takes longer to understand what fills it. One afternoon, I decided to invite them over. All of them. Not for a holiday. Not for a reason. Just for dinner. I kept the message simple. Thinking about making dinner this weekend. You're welcome to come by if you're free. No pressure. No expectation. I sent it and put the phone down. Hours passed. Then a reply. I think I can make it. Another. I'll try. Depends on work. And then later one more. I'll be there. It wasn't a perfect yes. But it was enough. That day, I found myself moving around the kitchen in a way I hadn't in a long time. Not rushed. Not anxious. Just familiar. I cooked more than I needed to. Set the table again. And this time, I didn't question the extra plates. When they arrived, it wasn't dramatic. No big reunion. No emotional moment at the door. Just greetings. Hugs that were warm, but slightly different than they used to be. More measured. But real. We sat down together. And for a while, it felt almost like before. Not exactly. Not completely. But close enough that I could recognize it. The conversation moved in different directions. Work. Plans. Stories I hadn't heard yet. I listened. Not the way I used to, waiting for the parts where I was needed. But just listening. As someone who was part of it, even if not at the center. At one point, there was a pause. Not an awkward one. Just a natural break in the conversation. And I looked around the table. Really looked. At who they had become. At how they spoke, how they carried themselves, how they interacted with each other. And I felt something shift again. But this time, it wasn't loss. It was perspective. I saw clearly that their lives were full. Full in ways that didn't always include me. But full because of everything we had built together. All those years of routines, of conversations, of being present, they hadn't disappeared. They had just expanded beyond me. That didn't make me unnecessary. It made me foundational. And that's a quieter role. Less visible. But not less important. After dinner, we lingered a little. No one rushed to leave. But no one stayed too long either. One by one, they gathered their things. Said their goodbyes. And stepped back into their own lives. I stood at the door after the last one left. Not because I was waiting for something. But because I wanted to hold on to that moment just a little longer. The house grew quiet again. The same way it always does. But this time, the quiet felt different. Not like something missing. More like something settled. I went back into the kitchen. Looked at the table. The empty plates. The small signs that people had been there not long ago. And instead of clearing everything right away, I sat down. In the same chair. In the same place. And let myself feel it. Not just what had changed. But what remained? Because that's the part one hadn't seen clearly before. I had been focusing so much on what I was no longer part of, that I hadn't fully recognized what I still was. I may not be in their everyday routines. I may not hear every story as it unfolds. I may not be the first person they turn to for everything anymore. But I am still part of their lives. Just in a different way. A quieter way. One that doesn't announce itself. One that doesn't demand attention. But one that's there, steady, underneath it all. And maybe that's what this stage is about. Not holding on to what was. Not trying to return to a version of life that no longer fits. But learning how to stand in this new space without feeling like you've been pushed out of the old one. Learning how to be present, without needing to be central. I sat there for a long time that night. Not thinking about what I had lost. But about everything that had led to this moment. All the years. All the small, ordinary days that didn't seem important at the time. And how they had quietly shaped something that still exists, even now. The house is still quiet in the mornings. The coffee still tastes the same. The light still flickers above the sink before settling. Not everything has changed. Just enough. And I've started to understand that this quiet, this distance, this shift, it isn't the end of something. It's just a part of the story where your role changes. Where you step slightly out of the center. And learn how to still belong.